Coming up, further fallout from the Chicago Bears trade of Justin Fields. Should the New York Football Giants have been in on the Kenny Pickett business? Plus, trade down scenarios for Joe Schoen and the Giants as another position of need could open up if Darren Waller decides to crumble and fall off the NFL earth. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz, and I don't know about you, buddy, but coming off St. Patrick's Day, I'm healthy, wealthy, wise, and maybe 90% corned beef.
Oh, I mean, listen, St. Patrick's Day was great. I was out of town on business, Adam. I was actually in Jacksonville watching the Players Championship golf-related stuff, so I got a little corned beef on my way home, feeling good now. But I'm ready to hit the ground running. We talked on Friday while I was in transit, and we thought that was going to be the end of some of the quarterback discussions that we were having. And then a funny thing happened where right afterwards, a bunch of activities happen across the league that kind of have some implications for the Giants.
You better believe it. So over the weekend, I hopped on, talked about Chicago Bears finally deciding we need to, at some point, move Justin Fields. They go ahead and they look and find a trade partner for him with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And all of a sudden, as I highlighted, you end up with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields making under, was it $3.8 million against the cap, and arguably a perfect position for the Pittsburgh Steelers over the next couple of seasons. But Andy, interestingly enough, as we were texting through it, because there's all those little elements of it, and it did re-bring up the Drew Lock $5 million guaranteed issue for Andy, and then also a Kenny Pickett angle to this that is at least interesting, although Kenny Pickett is, I would say, not the most sympathetic figure coming out of Pittsburgh as he lands with Philadelphia.
So yes, just like everyone predicted, not only would Justin Fields land in Pittsburgh, Russell Wilson would also land in Pittsburgh. I'm sure everyone had that on their bingo card when they were just trying to decide where the quarterback carousel was going to land.
Naturally.
But, it was interesting because a whole flurry of activities happened. Basically, Pittsburgh Steelers came in and said, Russ, you're the guy. You can start. Kenny Pickett got wind of this and was like, I'm angry for the 19th time. Please trade me. He moves on to Philadelphia. Philadelphia becomes the benefactor of a disgruntled employee wanting to move on from Pittsburgh. They get him for a pick swap and 2 late 7th round picks. So basically, to move up 20 spots in the draft in the, from 120 down to 98, they were able to get a backup quarterback in Kenny Pickett on the Philadelphia Eagles. That opens up all of a sudden room for Justin Fields to be able to move into the room. And so Justin Fields gets traded for a 6th round pick. Will move up to a 4th round pick if he plays over half the games, which is probably unlikely. Could happen if Russ gets hurt or he has poor play early on in the season. But we're talking about pick swaps, 7th round picks. Adam, we're talking about a 6th rounder that turns into a 4th. We're talking about a $2 million in contract value for Justin Fields and Kenny Pickett. It kind of reignited this fire that we talked about on our show last week when you were like, why are you so upset about Drew Lock at $5 million? And I think this was like kind of scratching the surface of why I was so frustrated. Look at these moves that were able to be had where you can get a young quarterback still on his rookie deal, still making a couple $1 million for minimal draft capital. And we're guaranteeing Kenny Pickett Drew Lock $5 million to be the backup to Daniel Jones, presumably. And so for me, this whole wave of activity, should the Giants have been interested in either Kenny Pickett or Justin Fields if this was the price that it was going to be?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, from the Justin Fields standpoint, I talked about this on over the weekend that it's hard to look at $1.6 million. This is when we said, well, the 5th-year option, who cares about the 5th-year option now? It costs you almost nothing to get him. Originally, and this is where Chicago got backed into a corner, right? They don't want to end up with another guy in the room with Caleb Williams, like, hey, we're moving on. We want it to be no controversy, nothing distracting from what we're trying to build here. Okay, great. So eventually the price just falls down and plummets to nothing. And they're like, yeah, great. Anybody that wants him can take him. 6th round pick. We love it. So at that point, that's not cost prohibitive to say, hey, if we went out and got a player like Justin Fields, and by the way, because we saw a lot of this, over the weekend, you're seeing it on social media, Justin Fields isn't that good. Look at his completion percentage, all that stuff. It's true. He's not like he's a great quarterback, but that's why it only cost a 6th round pick. And if you don't have to worry about the 5th-year option, then you go, it was a 6th round pick and $1.6 million to see. Now, I'm sure I'll add in this other layer to it from the Giants side. I'm sure the Giants looked at this and said, like, the distraction of it all, right? That's what I think a lot of this comes down to. When Drew Lock comes in and he gives his press conference, he says, "Yeah, I was told that Daniel Jones is the starting quarterback, and that's the deal, and it's all good." It's because there are layers to this, right? Players of a certain caliber. Justin Fields still feels like he can be a starting NFL quarterback in the league, and maybe he's only a year away. When Russ Wilson, it was the year good enough for him, a new contract, all that stuff, right? If you're Kenny Pickett, listen, chance to maybe reclimate myself a little bit. Jalen Hurts is a guy that can go down with injuries, played through some injuries last year. Maybe I get a chance to showcase myself. So there are layers to this in terms of age and where you want your career to go. And maybe the Giants had that same vibe of like, we want stability. We don't want to rock the boat. My contention is this boat is already rocking, right? Like this boat's like on its side. It's okay to bring in some other hands and see if you can get this thing righted. And a year from now, maybe none of these guys, Drew Lock included, are in the Giants' plans. Why not spend less money, arguably maybe have higher upside on two players, either one of them that are both younger than Drew Lock right now, and come in Kenny Pickett $1.98 million on the upcoming season and still another year of control before you have to decide about a fifth-year option. Not that that even matters at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Kenny Pickett, 80 passer rating, didn't throw very many touchdowns. If Giant fans were frustrated with Daniel Jones not throwing touchdown passes, oh, let me show you what's behind door number 2 with Kenny
Right.
Pickett, right? Like,
I
so
could
I
not
don't
throw
think
touchdown passes.
like they're like Spider-Man pointing at each other, right?
Right.
Where they're like, "Who? Wait, are you me? Is that you?"
We're all doing it.
So, but Adam, the whole thing is we talk about allocation of resources. It's like
Mhm.
Kenny Pickett is also under contract for $2 million next season. So if there is a grand plan to move off of Daniel Jones at the end of the year and go get a quarterback, Kenny Pickett seems to me like the perfect bridge type of quarterback where it's like, he could keep you afloat. You know, the Pittsburgh Steelers were competitive in games. He's not going to be the guy for the future, but at least he does that. And I think that's where the confusion to me lies in all this, committing the money that they did to Drew Lock up front. The way that I keep saying, the only thing that makes sense in all of this is that the Giants are not in the business of taking a quarterback at number 6. We talked about more likely, like maybe trading back at him is probably going to be the option because I don't think you tell Russell Wilson, like, Daniel Jones is the starter if you're going to draft a quarterback. I don't think you guarantee $5 million to Drew Lock if Daniel Jones is not the quarterback. So for me, I don't know. We mentioned it a few weeks back. It feels like the Giants trading back as opposed to moving up in the draft for a quarterback is starting to be more of a realistic option for them.
Yeah, it's funny actually because even realized about the Tyrod Taylor who did play games obviously for the Giants when Daniel Jones went down. But I think when you look at money, the association from a quarterback perspective should be if you're a backup or if there's a perceived starter in the building, it's the more you get paid is the further established it is what the hierarchy is, if that makes sense, right? If you're a quarterback that takes less money to go somewhere, sometimes it's because you want opportunity, right? Like you believe that there's a chance for something to work out there. In the case of Pickett, in the case of Fields, you're trying to reset yourself a little bit, the narrative around you. A Mariota, though, guy that's only 30 years old, going to Washington, like he's like, hey, if I get in the building, all of a sudden, maybe I find myself starting. Maybe I find myself earning another contract here down the road. So you'd like to think that Drew Lock understands, hey, $5 million, you get to be here. There is a health concern around Daniel Jones, and he's probably playing his cards right too. Maybe I get a chance to showcase something, and he looks around the league. He sees what happens with Gardner Minshew, right? Like it's not hard. The road is long for backup and journeyman quarterbacks. So by the time you get to the later stages of your career, into your 30s, all of a sudden you walk into a payday that you maybe didn't think was ever going to be there. So from the Giants standpoint, as you mentioned, now we've been on this train for quite some time, but not everybody wants to listen. I mean, we got fans out there. We're doing big numbers. We appreciate you. We hope you continue to support us. Trade down. Jordan Renan goes on over the weekend as well. And he says, boy, I tell you, I'm tongue in cheek here. I like Jordan Renan. Of my own volition, Jordan Renan said, I came up with this idea that maybe the Giants are going to trade down or more likely to trade down here to continue to try to figure out positions of need and fill areas that really matter on this roster, especially as you look at, as we talked about Minnesota getting a second first-round pick, as we talk about other QB-needy teams. Why do you think now more than ever it makes sense for the Giants to trade down?
Well, as we mentioned, I think you see that the quarterback room feels relatively established for the year. I know people don't want to hear that. And they're like, nope, we're getting JJ McCarthy at 6. Nope, we're trading up for Drake May at 3. I think all of these tea leaves that we've seen with the Russell Wilson going to Pittsburgh and Drew Lock being locked in as a $5 million backup quarterback, that I think Joe Schoen has given himself options outside of the quarterback room to go address in the first round. And when you think about it, there is still this massive elephant in the room that the Giants need a number one type of wide receiver. They need a playmaker on the outside. Joe Schoen went and acquired Brian Burns to be able to shore up the edge rushing position, which we thought was an area of need. That quickly kind of moves to an area of strength for the Giants with Burns and Thibodeau on the outside. You don't have to spend top line draft capital in order to address those needs. So for me, I kind of look at it and say, cornerback is still an area of need. I don't know if we finalize the safety position. We're probably not going to allocate too much resources to that. But this wide receiver room still needs to be shaped. They need to sign one, if not two wide receivers moving forward to be able to finalize this room. And to me, if the Giants aren't in the quarterback business, you see people like the Minnesota Vikings aligning draft capital, high first-round picks to be able to go move up the draft. You hear about the Raiders thinking about moving up the draft. You're wondering what the Broncos are going to do. Do they need to move up the draft for Sean Payton to get his guy? All of a sudden, if you are convinced that the Giants believe that Daniel Jones is going to be the starter week one, it puts them in an interesting position to get more draft capital to address all of these needs and not just one singular one in the first round.
Yeah, and this is where it becomes interesting because, again, Giants sit there at 6th overall. We know the Chargers are right there at 5. We know that right now, like there's this world where obviously Arizona just has Marvin Harrison Jr. fall right into their lap perfectly, and then you have those top 3 spots in the top 3 quarterbacks. Now the Patriots are there, and they seem as viable an option to trade down as well. And I just wonder about, there's clearly been this divide: the top 3 quarterbacks versus who the 4th is, the 5th is. Is JJ McCarthy worth a top 10 pick overall, right? Penix Jr., all these guys, Bo Nix going back into the first round, into the second round. Where are these guys going to land? And so the one concern, not concern here, just reality is, where does Minnesota need to get to? Where do the Raiders need to get to, right? And we walked down this scenario a couple episodes ago, so be sure to go check it out because we discuss how it could still work out for one of these teams if things fall the right way. But there is a world where teams jump past them, right? Or the board settles. So it's a real bummer that we won't know probably for another 2.5, 3 weeks whether or not JJ McCarthy is actually a top 10 prospect, right? Or is he settling into those teen rounds? But being available for a trade down matters. And by the way, the other thing I'll say here is, while no team is trading, the Minnesota Vikings aren't trading 11 and 23 to come up and take not the quarterback, but a team could come up and say, we need an offensive lineman. A team could come up and say, maybe we want a number 1 wide receiver. And do you think, I wonder if it's possible, as we'll talk about these moves here the Giants made kind of in their back-end free agency, solidifying some things, and perceptually a problem I have with Joe Schoen. There's a world where the Giants would walk away from a weapon at 6 to maybe get multiple solves over the course of the first and into the second round. Remember, they gave up a second-round pick going out the door for Burns. That's fine. It's worthwhile, but they may want to reset themselves because I think veteran, maybe cornerback and free agency could still be something for them. You mentioned safety. That feels a little bit further back on their needs chart, obviously, but they need a weapon. They need a wide receiver. We're going to talk about tight end here. We're going to talk about the other things that they need to get done. And at some point, you have to look at it and say, is one player at X value worth more than 2 or 3 at nearly maybe the same strength?
Yeah, and we keep talking about how the top of the board is going to go, and everyone was wondering if JJ McCarthy would be there at 6 for the Giants because they're in love with him. He's skyrocketing up draft boards. Maybe the best scenario is he is available for the Giants at 6, and they trade back to be able to get more capital for someone that is in love with him, that desperately needs to address the position. And Adam, that's not that far fetched. I mean, I think you and I both agree that Caleb Williams, Drake May, and Jaden Daniels will likely be off the board in the first 5 picks, right? I think that's pretty fair. The 3 quarterbacks out of 5.
Maybe some team makes a choice about, Marvin Harrison Jr., Patriots is 3 or something, right? Yeah.
Sure. And so then you think, okay, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, that's 6 players right there. That leaves you with JJ McCarthy, Joe Alt, and one of those wide receivers potentially being there at 6. That is the perfect situation for the Giants to be in. Quarterback, offensive lineman, explosive wide receiver. As you mentioned, you could stay there and take Rome Odunze. Let's say Minnesota is enamored with JJ McCarthy and they need to solve the quarterback position for Justin Jefferson so that he doesn't request a trade out. Imagine the Giants could move back to 11 and still get Rome Odunze and pick up a first-round pick. And, I think Joe Schoen would get a standing ovation from Giant fans at that point. If one of these wide receivers ends up falling to them, that could be like a home run dream scenario.
Yeah, and maybe it comes down to, you mentioned Joe Alt, maybe, Fashanu out of Penn State, right? Where is the needs here for offensive line from certain teams? Does anybody even in the top 10 want to make a margin move up the board? Right now you can go over on Tankathon. They talk about where the projections are going to go here. Well, Tennessee takes Joe Alt. You have Chicago taking Fashanu, and then you have the Jets taking Fuaga out of Oregon State. So, okay, that's 3 teams in the top 10 all taking offensive linemen. What if one of those 3 teams, what if the Jets, what if Chicago wants Joe Alt over maybe Tennessee, or vice versa? Any way you want to slice it, all of a sudden, even margin moves like that, come up to 6 and get the offensive lineman of your desire. Don't do what Joe Schoen did a couple years ago and say, hey, baby, we'll take whoever when we get there at 7 because we're going to take Kayvon Thibodeau. Guess what? That ended up with Evan Neal, which, by the way, informs something about this decision-making process for the Giants. So, as we remind you very quickly here that today's episode is, of course, brought to you by Pietential, Pietential.com, where you can go over and get a free online assessment tool for your well-being, free for individual users. Basically, a survey sets the baseline for where you are from a well-being standpoint, gives you tools to improve it, and also tracks your progress over time. That way, we know that we have an opportunity to improve ourselves over time and have consistency. That's something that the Giants are trying to do, that Joe Schoen is trying to do, that every single player hopefully is trying to do. So you get over to Pietential.com, Pietential today. Now, I said this matters here because the other moves that got made, which feel margin, obviously, and this is what you expect as free agency starts to wind down. The Giants, by the way, have just under $10 million in cap space at the moment, but they went out and made a handful of moves. They brought in Jack Stoll, the tight end, obviously a 6'4", 247-pounder. He was there playing with the Eagles and a part of their Super Bowl run as well. Tight end Chris Manhertz also brought in 6'6", 235. No, neither one of them is considered to be a receiving tight end. They also brought in 2 more offensive linemen in Stinney and also in Slotsman. So when you bring in 2 more tight ends and you bring in 2 offensive linemen, first, briefly on the offensive line part of it, gosh, is this concerning to? It's not concerning to me from the sense of let's shore up the line. We want to make sure that we're sound. We want to have redundancies. Awesome. Couldn't be happier to hear it. My problem that I have is that Joe Schoen did draft McKathan, excuse me. He did draft Izudu. He does have Evan Neal. Now, listen, at the highest level, Evan Neal, if he's not going to work out, we know we need to be prepared to move on because he was plugged in as a starter. These other 2 players haven't fully ever gotten there. But I just do look at this and say, on the one hand, great. You're cementing the offensive line. You're bringing in depth and experience. So good. The other side of it is Joe Schoen saying, well, I missed on Evan Neal. I moved up the board to get Izudu. That didn't pan out. And I brought in McKathan, and it doesn't look like he's going to be a contributor. That's a lot of draft capital at a lot of different levels for Joe Schoen only a year or 2 later to say, yep, didn't quite get there. I'd rather you, cut your losses and move on. But it's just Joe Schoen lives in a very kind of 50-50 GM landscape where when he makes a move or a draft or anything he does in the offseason, you go, yeah, sometimes I look, oh man, that was really smart. What a great move. And we talk about the top here, Drew Lock. You go, hey, that makes kind of sense. Then the rest of the offseason plays out and you go, I don't know if that really made any sense. So it's hard for me to look right now at the line and not at least have some curiosities about where Joe Schoen is, understanding they have seemingly eliminated offensive line as a need coming into this draft class.
Oh, I mean, you can say that they eliminated it as a need. I don't know if I
They're
would
not going
necessarily.
first round on it, and I'd be hard pressed to think they go second round on it as well. I'll put it that
Correct.
way.
I still think so. With all the signings that we've had, Adam, here's a question for you:
All right.
Is Jermaine Illuminor going to play guard or tackle for the Giants?
Wherever he's needed.
I mean, but that, how crazy is that? We're like, we've addressed the
TBD.
offensive line. I'm like, great. What position does he play? You're like, don't know yet. We're going to figure it out in camp. You're like,
That's right.
oh, okay. So that was one of our big signings, right? Like, so to me, like, there's still a lot of question marks about all this roster construction. But to your point, it kind of makes me sit here and say, we've whiffed in the draft. We don't necessarily know who's going to be playing where yet across this offensive line. I still have concerns. I think Joe Schoen has allocated money in free agency to try to solve some of these problems. But still, it feels like there are a lot of question marks. When we don't know who our starting 5 offensive linemen are, and we've already went out and signed 2 and spent 2 first-round picks and a second-round pick on offensive linemen, and we don't know who's going to be starting, that to me is a little bit of a concern. And I think you're right on the money saying, what is Joshua Zudu? What is Marcus McKathan? Where do they fit into this thing if we're making all of these fringe signings? There's still a lot of question marks for me around the offensive line, and that's concerning because we've put a lot of capital, draft capital and salary cap at this offensive line to figure it out. I don't even know if we're 80% of the way there.
100%. So at a minimum, 100%. I don't know if they're 80% of the way there. Yeah.
100%.
But and that's why. So again, at a minimum, we think you can get back to the third round now in the draft. So you took one of those needs and pushed it further down the board here, right? You go out and you get Brian Burns. There was a time when we thought, hey, listen, edge rusher could certainly be in the discussion, right? Dallas Turner. Well, no. Okay. Now that's getting pushed down the line here a little bit as well. Cornerback still exists. Safety can exist, but I think that's more of a mid-round even at that point too, just because of where the value is of that position, right? So all these things, they have at least created a little bit more of a hierarchy, at least it seems like, in what we're going to go into the draft and really make sure that we want to go and attack. An offensive line should move down a little bit, but you're right. This is going to be an interesting offseason. New offensive line coach. Maybe you're just giving them a ton of options and you're saying nobody, even our draft picks anymore, has any clout inside of the depth chart room. This is for our new coach to come in and say, I mean, outside of Andrew Thomas.
Yeah,
you, and you, right? This is what's going to be. And they also added in, by the way, a veteran center who I forgot to mention here in behind Schmitz. So you want to have that stability there as well, because it was an okay rookie season. It wasn't a great one. It wasn't, best center in the draft class type of rookie season. So you still have a question mark there as well. Other question mark that we have here, which will relate back to the trade down scenario momentarily, is one Darren Waller, which, by the way, also ties into Joe Schoen, who gave up a third-round compensatory pick to bring in a 31-year-old tight end who we know, when healthy and on the field, can certainly be good, and when not healthy and off the field, looks like a waste of draft capital. Now he's contemplating retirement. Maybe it's basically one way or the other. Looks like he retires or the Giants are going to cut him. Okay, that's certainly an interesting option that the Giants didn't think they were going to be going down after 1 year. But if they choose to go that route, it's worth reminding it's not going to happen anytime soon, because the best opportunity for the Giants to get out from underneath Darren Waller and have it be as minimal in terms of hurting their dead cap and hurting their cap and helping their cap space, I should say, is a post June 1 cut, 2.45 in dead, 11.625 in cap relief. So whatever you think it is, the best way to know maybe before it actually happens is to watch the decisions that this team makes around that position, including going out and signing 2 more while more blocking tight ends. They brought more bodies into the room. They brought back Lawrence Cager as well, which I thought was a sneaky, low-key, really good move for them. I already think the tea leaves tell you that one way or the other, Darren Waller's not going to be here. It's just a matter of, is it his, quote, choice, or do the Giants acknowledge the mistake and move on?
Well, the Giants are going to, there's certainly no reason for the Giants to push Darren Waller now. I think they want Darren Waller back because this team can't afford to just let good talent, when healthy, walk out the building. We don't have enough talent across the whole roster to just be able to make those decisions. But I think Joe Schoen is going to look and say, Mr. Waller, we need a decision from you before the draft because we have to make sure that we understand what we have to go address. They've started creating some security blankets with Stahl and others. Lawrence Cager coming back. We obviously know we both like Daniel Bellinger and think that he can be a solid starting NFL tight end in this league.
Yep.
But the Giants need some answers, because there's going to be a decision tree and a decision to make. If Darren Waller decides to retire, or he's like, my heart's not in it, I need more time, then the Giants may have to say, well, we have to move on from you because we can't be in no man's land. We have to make our own decisions on this. You mentioned whether it's Darren Waller deciding to leave or the Giants deciding to cut him, it's about $6.7 million basically in cap savings. But that would open up another area of need for the Giants that they would have to go presumably address in the draft. And maybe that factors into the trade down plan. Maybe there are scenarios where the Giants are starting to think, like, if we don't have Darren Waller, now we have a glaring hole at tight end. We have a huge wide receiver 1 hole, Adam. We need a lot of help on the offensive playmaking side of the ball.
And that's why, my friends, if you go back to this draft and you think that a trade down scenario is possible, because I multitask like the best in the business, when I'm over on Pro Football Network running a mock draft in the background here and the Giants come up at 6 and there's trade offers, guess what? The Denver Broncos are one of those teams. They want to give us another first-round pick next season. They want to give us a third-round pick this year to come up from 12. And when you get to 12, guess who's sitting right there? Brock Bowers, my guy, who we earlier in this offseason, I said, hey, who knows where he's going to be in the hierarchy. Obviously, positionally, he's starting to settle down in. More quarterbacks are coming up. Wide receivers are cementing themselves, offensive linemen, right? So he's going to get pushed down this needs board. Now, by the way, I don't think this is realistic, so I won't put in the fact that Roman Dunze is also there at 12 right now, and that would be the dream of dreams for the New York Football Giants. But if they trade back like this, whether it's for this year, extra capital, or the following season, and they see a guy like Bowers, like I do think that if you come out of the top 10 and then you look at that position and you mentioned Daniel Bellinger, we like him. We want him to be an all phases tight end for us, and he's trying to build towards that. We have Cager. We have other blocking guys. It's going to sort itself out in camp. That's a weapon. He counts as a weapon that you can play in line. You can spread out wide. Perceptually, it doesn't have WR next to his number, but it can be just as impactful for this team and this roster based on his size and his skill set. I think that this is the kind of move that Giants fans should at least have on their mind, moving down the board and letting what it might actually be a higher talent fall to you because of the position. I think Andy's pushback here is going to be first round pick on a tight end, 5th-year option on a tight end. I don't know if I love that, but you have to, I think, at least be open to that possibility here.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if the Giants trade out of the top 10, I think that expands the list of the types of
Sure.
players or the positions that they could address at that point. I think it opens up to other wide receivers. I think it opens up another trade back. I think it opens us up to be able to potentially get a cornerback as well. There's a bunch of areas that the
Yeah,
Giants
and
may
that
have to go.
just real quick, the cornerback position I think becomes even more viable here too in trade downs because it's right where that curve falls, and you go, oh, maybe we're taking a guy that is there at 14ish, 15ish when we're at 12, and we feel like we end up plugging in a really high end number 2 across from Deontay Banks. So it's interesting to think about it that way as well.
So do you think, and it's just a random question for you. Do you
Hmm.
think it's factoring into Joe Shane's mind at all? Like at 6, if I take a quarterback, I'm resetting the clock and I'll probably get another year. If I trade back and I get an additional first round pick, but it's not until next year, maybe I'm not around to be the one making that pick if things go like awry or they go south. Where do you think the GM mentality is when you know how pressurized this situation is? You have to get it right. You want to get more draft capital because you think it'll make the team better. But if you're not getting 2 first round picks in this draft,
Sure.
are you the one even being able to make those picks at a later date?
Yeah, and you know what? I'll take this back to the top with the perception of Justin Fields or Kenny Pickett or Drew Lock. We may not, look at Drew Lock as being, obviously stability if Daniel Jones can't go. But I do wonder if Joe Schoen and Brian Dable looked at this as exactly what you're talking about. Well, what if Daniel Jones isn't ready to go or not? What if we wanted to trade back and get draft capital for next year's class and we want to still feel like we're going to be here? I think a lot of these decisions, including maybe going a little aggressively to go get Brian Burns, who I think it's a good move, right? But you're giving a contract to a guy based on what he's going to elevate to and how he's going to elevate Kayvon Thibodeau as well. I think the moves were made to make sure that this season doesn't look like last year, that they're a couple of wins better than that they're in the conversation for the playoffs a little bit longer and feel like a more legitimate team. There were a lot of injuries a year ago. But if he does that, then I think it just informs the internal conversation with John Mara and ownership that says, hey, listen, we're still another year away, but you'll see the footsteps this season. And as long as Joe Schoen feels like he's safeguarded against a disaster, he actually knows that he's pretty darn secure to go take the quarterback another year from now or make those types of moves. Now, it can still go off the rails, but that's, in my mind, that's what's informing the way that they're doing things and how Joe Schoen feels about his job security. I don't think he feels a ton of pressure that if I don't do it this year, I'm going to be out the door or I'm going to have to let go of Dable. Like, I think there's actually a pretty strong commitment from John Mara and ownership to say, we gave you the contracts we did because we kind of knew. We kind of knew that this was a mixed bag in terms of where our franchise was. And as long as this looks like it's going in the right direction, you're not going to be at risk of losing your job. And listen, that's famous last words, but that's at least how it seems to me right now.
Yeah, it feels like you just can't win 4 games, right? Like that just
That's what,
feels
yeah.
like the one where it's like you can't be a disaster. Brian Burns doesn't make an impact. Daniel Jones is injured, and then Drew Lock is throwing a bunch of interceptions, and all of a sudden they bottom out and they get the 5th pick in the draft, like right around there again next year. That feels like the doomsday scenario.
Well, and even by the way, though, it's like if that happened, Joe Schoen would turn to John Mayer and go, "Well, listen, I told you, you drafted this kid before I got here. He's just injury prone. It stinks, right? But don't worry, we'll cut ties, and guess what? We've got our pick." I think that'd be hard. Like my line was like, be a 7-win team, be competitive, have the offense look like it has something going for it here, and then you live with the results on a game-to-game basis, right? Like coming out of last year, you still look at a lot of things and go, "This offense can't move the football. Like we're one of the worst teams in the league."
Right. I think at the end of the day for Joe Schoen, it's basically like this. I want to see the vision. I want to be like,
Right.
okay, maybe
Right.
we don't have that one guy in that one spot, or maybe that's not here, but I see what we're building. I see the roster construction. I see the path forward. It felt like last year, everything was kind of twisting in the wind where it's like, we gave Daniel Jones his money, so we think he's the starter. And then he gets hurt. We don't have any, we don't know what we're doing backup wise. Tyrod Taylor gets injured. Then all of a sudden you have Wink Martindale being kind of a loose cannon on the defensive side, being like, I'm just going to worry about me and I'm going to blitz 90% of the time and go absolutely crazy. And then I'm going to get in arguments and then I'm going to back channel things to Jay Glazer, telling him how much like this is an unmitigated disaster.
All part of
Like
the process.
that was not part of the process.
Oh, no.
You could not, at the end of this year, you could not see the vision. You're like, we might lose Mike Kafka. We don't know if we have our franchise quarterback. Wink Martindale is yelling and screaming and is probably going to leave after cursing and storming out of the building. There was no vision. It feels like Joe Schoen, make this team competitive and just show us where your mind is and like how we can improve and get better. And maybe Daniel Jones plays decent and they win 7 games to your point. And now you can say, well, we can move off of Daniel Jones, or we're just one big time wide receiver or big time impact player away from where we want to be. I think that buys Joe Schoen and team enough time. So I think the trade down scenario is definitely in play.
Yeah.
I think it's more impactful if they get 2 first-round picks this year to be able to move back. But there is a scenario where they take a first rounder here, a first rounder next year, and maybe sprinkle something else in to be able to say, look, we're still progressing and we have ammo should we need it next year.
Yeah, especially if you think that the Vikings take 11 and 23 and that gets them up to the top 5 to get their quarterback, and you have that position for next year for yourself. You're a mid-20s pick and you get a pick from somewhere. It can all work itself out here for the Giants. The problem has been, generally speaking, that it hasn't all worked out for the Giants here of late over the last, decade or so. No big deal, though. The bottom line is we're going to be talking about now turning our attention. Listen, I mean, it is over a month. We're talking 5 weeks away from the draft. We still have these margin moves. When we come in next time, it's going to be resetting this free agency board. We've already highlighted some cornerbacks, veteran experienced players to bring in the building. How else could the Giants look to solidify positions of need, improve their depth, and get to a place where when we look at the draft board, we can have a pretty clear picture about what makes sense and what needs to be addressed to feel like this is a solid foundation team going into the upcoming season. You get us over on YouTube for that at One Giant Podcast, over on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at AndyMac214, and at Adam Armbrecht, wherever you get us on those podcast feeds. 100% free. Supporting the show really helps us. Supporting our sponsors also really helps us. Until next time, though. Oh boy, I can feel the corned beef seeping through me. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.